My name is John McDonnell. I'm elected as a Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington way back in 1997, so I've been an MP now for 28 years. Before that, I've been in the party 50 years. Before that, I was on the Greater London Council with Ken Livingstone as leader. I was his deputy and chair of finance. And before that, community activist and a trade unionist. So my background is working class, basically. I was born in Liverpool and then moved south. Working class, engagement in the labour and trade union movement from a very early age, and then as a representative of working class people in different forms, and motivated by concepts of socialism, simple as that, really. So I joined the Labour Party because I saw that as the vehicle in which I could change society and change it in a way that brings about radical change in terms of the redistribution of wealth and power towards working class people, and that's what socialism is all about. I've always tried to engage in discussions as much as possible. My view is that if you want to change the world, you need to understand it. You specifically need to understand your society, and in particular you need to understand the economy of that society. It's not about economic determinism or anything like that. It's trying to ensure that you understand how the economy works, how it has an impact upon every part of our life, and then therefore how you can change it. What do you disagree with? What do you target for change, and how you bring about that change? One of the roles of the Left Book Club has always been, right through its history, is basically enable people to have that understanding of the world and maybe get a shared understanding. Because if you can understand it, and if you can understand the theories which explain the world and how our society operates, you can then work with others to change it. And that's the whole concept. We use that expression praxis, which is the combination of theory and practice, and that's what the Left Book Club was always about. And when the Left Book Club was revived 5 or 6 years ago, I encouraged it. I thought this is a wonderful endeavour. Interestingly enough, more recently, I was contacted by a member of PCS at its conference, for Trade Unions Conference, and I'd met him before, and he comes from West London, and he said his dad had recently died, and he's left him this big pile of books, and would I be interested in them? So I popped round and said, definitely. And they're literally 20s and 30s, well, 30s mainly. It was the Left Book Club, the original Left Book Club books, and lots of pamphlets as well, and all the rest of it. So I've just been reading through them at the moment, the Straights and all the Laskys of this world. And you just realise what a movement it was then, bringing thousands, tens of thousands of people together. And it was a genuine book club. They read the book, they came together, they discussed it. And from that, if you look at those people that were inspired by it, they went on to be representatives in our movement, but they're also the ones that set up the organisations to change society. So its impact was immense. Incredibly immense, and that's the sort of thing I think the Left Book Club could be today. It could be that influential because people are desperate for ideas. They're fed up with what's happening to them. They're making huge challenges. So they want to understand the world more, and they want to understand the strategies that you can pursue, and also learn from the history of it. What's worked, what hasn't worked. Let's not repeat the same mistakes. Are there new ideas coming in onto the scene? And that's what the Left Book Club will do.
Indeed. I mean, it was the Left Book Club at its time and at its height, in the late 30s, early 40s, had about 57,000 members and 1,200 reading groups across the country. And it must have had such an impact that then the right tried to start the Right Book Club, which, was, fantastically unsuccessful.
Yeah. It was a tribute to the Left Book Club, wasn't it? But they tried it. Interestingly enough, reading the ones that I've just inherited, although I had lots before, but it was interesting what came out of that as well, which I think is highly relevant. The number of books that were written about the rise of fascism, and in particular the Spanish Civil War. Interestingly enough, in one of the books that I was given by the local councillor who passed away, in it was tucked leaflets for meetings on the Spanish Civil War and the support for the International Brigade. So there was a real debate and thorough understanding of what fascism was about, how the Spanish Civil War actually was part of seeking to defeat fascism, and the consequences of not defeating it at that stage. And it just sends echoes through time about what's happening in terms of the far right in our own country at the moment and across Europe and elsewhere. So it's right it's not history repeating itself, but it's history actually having taken place and us learning the lessons from that. And if you think in the 30s, then people sitting down in their rooms or in the labour halls or in their trade union offices just to jointly read the book together and then understanding what fascism meant, a lot of that motivated people then, that when the Second World War came about, they were at the forefront of trying to defeat Hitler.
Absolutely, and I think the Left Book Club was always, and we are trying to do that and be that again, which is that it's about, as you said, reading and creating a collective understanding towards action, and also particularly to support the building, the maintenance, and the development of our institutions to be able to actually, in a way, prefigure what we would like to see in change. So, I think that's also related to your time at the GLC, the Greater London Council, was in a way the GLC was arguably one of the last remaining actually democratic institutions in a way in almost on a national level insofar as London obviously being being a very significant part of Britain and where a lot of ideas also disseminate. And unfortunately that was destroyed by authoritarianism and the centralized power and so on. How do you think collective learning, particularly that the Left Book Club can support, can create democratic spaces that can resist our institutions being shut down and resist institutions also being taken over? Because there's certain institutions that are being shut down and there's certain institutions that are being transformed beyond recognition.
Yeah. G.K. Galbraith was the economic historian about the 29 economic crash. And he said that, because they said, how do you prevent crashes like that in the future? And he said, you can set up institutions, but the best is memory. Memory is the best weapon you have against things like that. And I think that's the same across all politics as well. The GLC was most probably the period in many people's lives where the left had the most fun ever. It was just, I look back on it now and I think it was nirvana. How the hell did we get away with that? But it was based upon, interestingly enough, it was based upon people coming together and book-based as well. People come together with their shared experiences as trade unionists, as campaigners on a whole different range of issues. Some of those issues, campaigners on new forms of struggle, particularly around equality, because we had people coming from the lesbian and gay movement, and we had people coming from the anti-racism movement coming together. But it was based upon their personal experiences and organisational experiences, but it was also based upon a lot of reading as well. I'll just give the example. We looked at, there were books at the time emerging about Red Bologna and what was happening in Italy at the time. And we thought, these are fantastic ideas that are coming forward, but we read in depth. And we developed the theory and discussion of in and against the state, which was the state as a set of institutions, but it's a relationship more than anything. So what should the left do? Reading Gramsci, the publications of Gramsci's works, which were emerging at that time, in that decade, the view was go within the state. So stand for elected office or become a civil servant or a bureaucrat or whatever. And in that way you can go within the state but change the relationship with the state. So you're in it, but you're against it. And that's what the GLC was all about. It was based upon a lot of struggles, but it was also based upon a lot of reading. And our manifesto in 1981 for the GLC was huge. It was a massive manifesto because so many people had come together, writing different sections, going out there, learning from their struggles, talking to people that maybe they were not engaged with before. And it became quite a detailed document that once we got into power, we thought that's really useful, but let's open the doors of County Hall. And we literally just opened them up and everyone turned up. And every night at County Hall in different committee rooms, you'd have people talking from about the details of the transport policy, equalities policies, anything. We had a radio forum. We had no means of communication at that point in time. There was no internet, no social media. So the only thing that we had was community radio broadcasting, which was completely illegal. We had one guy turn up, he was broadcasting from a tree on Hampstead Heath. It's that sort of stuff. And it was wild, but what came out of it was that people felt they had control again, they had power again through that institution. So for me, it's learning those lessons that it's not necessarily the institutions you establish, it's the method of working. And that concept of in against the state was the method that we used then. But it also had to be linked to the traditional struggles in terms of trade union negotiations or political representation, but it also had to be linked to direct action too. So all of those lessons have to be learnt, but sometimes memory doesn't last that long. That's where books come in. When people are writing those books, they're based upon the experience. You can come together and then literally it consolidates the lessons that have been learnt, and from that then you think, well, where do we go next? What's the next movement? What's the next struggle that we go into? And then also, yeah, how do we design the next institutions that we need, but recognise institutional change has to be almost like a permanent revolution in terms of transforming them. And again, that's why I don't want to over-egg the pudding, but that's why I think the Left Book Club re-establishing itself in the way it has, broadening it so you're bringing people together all the time, I think it could have a significant effect. As I say, I don't want to exaggerate that, but there's nothing else going on. I don't want to be brutal about this, but there's no political education in the Labour Party anymore. That's been closed down, and I really regret that. The training courses that they have now are not about our history or our theories or how do you develop socialism. It's about how do you become a leader? What are leadership skills, that sort of thing. Leadership skills are irrelevant if you haven't got any ideology or any idea of where you want to go or the society that you're working in. So what there is the vacuum now at the moment. I think that the Left Book Club desperately needs to fill, and we've got to rise to it, that challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, just to continue on what you said around method, and actually, political education is also about developing methods, and therefore it's, transferable to many areas of life, from institutions to, like your local soup kitchen to, wherever it might be. You've also been a part of some quite concrete, kind of proposals, and actually tried to start going about them, from the 4-day week to renationalization to some of the work you're doing around health. And these seem like policies that you kind of decided and settled on were vehicles to something larger, something bigger. How do you think reading for action and collective learning in how it also creates methods and creates, I guess, community, can help people understand these alternatives and turn that understanding into organised campaigns and power?
Yeah. I don't do meetings around the country anymore like stand-up, where you go along and you make a speech, everyone applauds, or sometimes they fall asleep. But I don't do that anymore. I only do meetings where I think at the end of it there's going to be some agreement on what the action will be. So if I'm going along to talk about something, it's with a very specific purpose. Or if I'm going along to listen to something, it's a specific purpose. It's not for entertainment. And I think that's what reading does as well. If we're going along the path of establishing book clubs on the scale that they were in the 30s, we've got to recognise that in the 30s they were done for a purpose. It was to understand the world, but it wasn't then to sit down and contemplate it. It was then to say, well, what do we do about it? And that's what we've got to do now. And it's also explaining to people that they can have some agency in this. And socialism is all about the transfer of power into working class people so that we can transform our society. So every one of those books that are being published at the moment, they're all about explaining to people what's happening now in some spheres of activity that maybe we haven't come across before, and therefore what people are doing in developing the ideas for change. And I think it's just raising the whole level of debate, because I think it has sunk in recent years. And as I say, the Labour Party, no political education. In terms of other organisations, they've struggled. And to a certain extent, it's a bit like the GLC. The GLC was suppressed and abolished because it challenged the system. It was a naked challenge. So there was no way that Mrs. Thatcher, who was in government, was going to let us survive. I think we pushed her over the edge into insanity at the end of the day, because she literally couldn't cope with us anymore and just had to abolish us. But what was interesting, the residue of that was a deep regret about what had happened, but then to learn the lessons. How did it happen? And how can we stop that happening again? And again, a lot of the books that have been written up since then around that period are the ones where people are looking at the devices for how you sustain a socialist government, how you sustain socialist in power in any form. And again, the Left Book Club idea is to make sure that's disseminated more widely, and then people come together. And you're building a movement, that will say, okay, we understand it now. What do we do about it? Where have we worked in the past? Where have we gone wrong? Let's be honest about that. But then also, let's just move rapidly. And there's a sense of urgency at the moment. And the sense of urgency is based upon the rise of the far right. And we're seeing it in our own country under reform. We're faced with a reform government at the moment. That's the reality of what's going on. The rise of the far right, I think the grotesque levels of inequality that are expanding in our society. And then to top all of that, the biggest threat is the loss of the planet and climate change. So there's a sense of urgency. We need to act. And that's why to act, you need to understand. To understand, then you need to share that understanding. Then sharing that understanding, you need to come together as an entity, a cooperative group, and then you link up with others. I think there's a new wave building at the moment. I'm always the eternal optimist, but actually I do feel it on the ground. When I'm doing meetings or I'm on picket lines or on demonstrations, there's a large number of people like me, these sort of archaeological exhibits from the past. But if you look at that new wave, they're largely young people. They're diverse, and a full range of people of all ethnicities, backgrounds, that sort of thing. And you can feel it. And I think a lot of them are looking at, where do we go from here? And then what we've got to do is make sure that they have access to the information and knowledge of where you could go and where we've been in the past, and what works and what don't. So this is just a propitious time, but there's got to be a sense of urgency, because the threats are so large and the dangers are so great.
I think one of the most important kind of threads in what you've said and what you say, I think often, is this thing about agency. And I think, it's one of those things where obviously it's easy to utter and it's important to utter, but to actually embed that in society, after society has been battered for decades and decades, the fabric of society is one of the hardest things. And I always find it, I'm from a background where, people are constantly, whether it's at the Kurdish Community Centre or wherever, constantly talking politics. But in Britain, there seems to be this deliberate and by design anti-public intellectualism, which actually seems to be one of the ways in which people are constantly felt to not have agency. And also, the political tradition I come from is that development of public intellectualism, of discussing and establishing collective lines, is one of the most important forms of self-defense. And so I think when we talk about these reading groups, I agree, it's important obviously not to over exaggerate what one project or one institution of course can do, but I think there's something about people just coming together in their local pub and discussing anything, whether that's a book, whether that's an article, whether that's watching a video together, to also, because these waves will come, and they do come in kind of cycles, but sadly the wave then kind of runs out of force again, because there isn't the other elements around it to sustain it. So I guess the question is, particularly right now, and with a lot of young people and the wave building in a lot of young people, and in an era of individualized social media, why do you think particularly collective reading and discussion is still essential for building effective political resistance?
I fully agree with you about the anti-intellectualism, but that's deliberate, isn't it? The last The last thing the system wants, or the capitalist class want, is for you to understand how the system works. Because if you start understanding it, you'll think, I've had enough of this, and you'll want to break through it. So there's been that's a long tradition in this country, the suppression of the development of what Gramsci calls organic intellectuals. Of course there've been. In fact, you're almost, there's a humiliating process. You're getting too big for your boots, that sort of stuff, And I think it's particularly because we're in the belly of the beast of capitalism where it first started. There's a longer tradition than that here. My family from Ireland, there isn't that tradition there. There's a tradition of intellectual challenge. And it's interesting, if you look back, it's certainly in the 19th century, and even into the 20th century, a lot of the working class leaders in this country came from Ireland. And if you look at it now, a lot of the working class struggles are being led by people who are from other migrant communities largely, because they don't have that suppression tradition that is particularly a bit intensive here. So that's what we have to break out of, and that's what we do. Things do come in waves. I'm not into, well, the old idea of Kondratiev cycles of the economic crisis in capital. As I say, I'm not an economic determinist, but you do have to take into account the crises of capitalism that come along, and that will influence people because it affects their standard of living. And then at different stages, well, people just say, I don't want to live like this anymore. I've had enough. What do we do about it? That's when we come in and say, actually, shall we talk about that? Here's a book you can read about how that will explain why you're living in these conditions. It might give you some ideas of where to go forward. And by the way, other people are reading that book as well. Why don't you come together? And I think that's the development that we've now got to see. And actually, it's happening already. And if you look at one of the waves 10 years ago, or it might be longer, when Occupy was active, the good thing about Occupy was about direct action, but more importantly, it was when the occupations took place, all the different seminars and discussions that were going on in the street or in the universities or wherever they occupied. And I think we're moving towards that period. So when people are on that Palestinian demonstrations every month, they're talking about what's happening in Gaza, but people are talking about other issues as well. How about how's it going? What's happening on this particular dispute? And when interestingly enough, you'll see more and more in this coming period of Unite banners being on those demonstrations we haven't seen up until now, only a few branches. I think you'll see more and more. That gives those Unite members to then talk about their dispute in Birmingham on the bin strike and that sort of thing. So there's an integration of thought, if you like, that's coming on. What the Left Book Club is doing is, to a certain extent, institutionalising it a bit, but to a certain extent it's giving a grounding to that so people will know where to go or where we can recommend people to go. If you're worried about that problem, here's something that you might want to read about it. And actually, if you do want to read it, there's a Left Book Club in your local area that you could join in. I think it'll take off because there's a hunger now for new ideas and there's a hunger for understanding.
Thank you very much. And this might mean that you're repeating a few things, but just I guess to sum up some of the things you've said, why should people across Britain join Left Book Club and take active part, particularly in building these 100 reading groups that we're aiming for, and what difference can this campaign make to our communities and movements, kind of from the local out?
Yeah. I'll use language my mum would tell me off for, which is if you're really pissed off and you don't want to take this shit anymore, you need to start thinking about how you can contribute to changing it. Don't just sit there. That's the point. That's the message I'm saying to people. Just don't tell me how bad things are. Stop moaning at me. Start understanding why we're in this crap. Start thinking about it, but then we can help you think about that more thoroughly, where you get a better understanding of it. And we can link you up with others who feel exactly the same as you, that you can't go on like this. We can't take this anymore. And it will enable you then to, instead of just bottling in that frustration, which isn't good for your mental health anyway, it will help you understand why we're here, but it will also, more importantly, enable you to have a bit more influence and power to change things. And you become the subject. You're no longer the object anymore. So I think that message is, enough is enough. We've had enough, Here's the chance of real change here. Get involved. And one way of getting involved is action, of course it is, but you've got to link that action through understanding. And this is the best way of getting that understanding. And I think in that way we're going to ride a tide of that wave that's coming at the moment. I also think as well that when you're talking to people these days, people are, I think, much more into realizing that this is a cultural issue as well. You know, everything around you is telling you you can't change anything. Everything around you is telling you actually the world is all about short-term benefit rather than long-term transformation. So this is, I think, the opportunity of transforming that completely. I think people are up for it, certainly the new generation. One of the things that I want the Left Book Club to go into as well is because I think books are absolutely critical. But I've increasingly come to the view that cinema is most probably one of the most effective ways of changing ideas. And that's why that's why Trotsky had the trains going around, the cinema trains and all the rest of it, because they understood the new medium. And funny enough, I was talking to my grandchildren about this, about reading and how much they read and how much they should read. It's important. And they said, "What do you read?" I said, "Well, I read quite a bit, but actually, what cinema does, it brings together the words, the action, the art all together as well." And so, one of the discussions we're trying to have with people is how you develop cinema much more effectively than we have at the moment. And maybe it will be left cinema clubs that will develop on from the Left Book Club.
Sounds brilliant. Thank you so much.
All right.